G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle. Sorry I've been away for about a week. I'm actually really busy with work at the moment, and unfortunately, private life comes first. Anyway, today's video is about Games Workshop and if they're a monopoly. Now to begin with, I've tried to make this video for several years. I've made and chosen not to upload the videos on at least 3 different occasions. At first, it was all about trying to explain how Games Workshop was a monopoly, which, well, people instantly balk at it and they say legally it isn't, followed by some kind of slur for even suggesting such a thing. I also tried to explain how they hoard IP, sit on ideas over the years, and in the end, it was comments from a few friends which caused me to revisit the subject. And after a lot of posts in the salt mines and some people urging me to do so, I've decided to take another crack at the subject. Now, the subject isn't inherently negative, so the rabid fanboys who like to complain about the negativity on the channel, ironically, step back, take 5, chill out. We're only talking facts here today, definitions and comparisons. Now, with that in mind, are they legally a monopoly according to US law? No, they don't meet that criteria for their antitrust laws. I won't dispute this. But do they exhibit monopolistic behaviour in other ways, such as economically? Well, today we will find out. So, first thing is, does Games Workshop have competition? Because, well, a monopoly can't really exist if they have competition, right? Well, how do you define competition? Are there other companies which produce miniatures or miniature war games? Sure there are. But are they in any way comparable to Games Workshop? Let's use an example of a completely different company. Let's say Coca-Cola. If I start making my own cola drink, technically I'm a competitor. But in what way am I any threat to their business? Nobody is going to get frustrated with Coke and swear off it in favour of my own salty cola. Having competitors does not mean that you aren't a monopoly. So what does dictate if you are or aren't a monopoly? Well, here's a problem. Various dictionaries define it as, to paraphrase, the exclusive possession or control of the supply or trade in a commodity or service. Either a company or group having exclusive control over a commodity of service, or a commodity or service in the exclusive control of a company or group. Okay, what does that actually mean? Well, if you and you alone have control of a commodity such as plastic elves, that's a monopoly. Does Games Workshop own plastic fantasy elves? No. Do they own exclusively, however, blind plastic fantasy elves who live under the sea and ride gator sharks? Yes. Of course, anyone can come along and try and make their own version, but that's where the copyright waters begin to muddy. The whole point of Age of Sigmar's universe is maximum copyright. That's why there's silly names and outlandish races, not to achieve any great creative vision or tell a story like the old Warhammer games. Instead, it exists to shore up their IP. So let's move beyond these very vague dictionary definition, which, well, it really serves nothing for the argument today. And rather, let's see what investment speculators have to say about monopolies. They say that a monopoly refers to when a company and its product offerings dominate a sector or industry. Monopolies can be considered an extreme result of free market capitalism in that, absent any restriction or restraints, a single company or group becomes large enough to own nearly all of the market. Goods, supplies, commodities, infrastructure, and assets for a particular type of product or service. The term monopoly is often used to describe an entity that has total or near control of the market. Okay, does that sound like any company in particular? We all know, obviously, that I think it's set in stone that for all intents and purposes, they're functionally a monopoly, especially in the fantasy and sci-fi miniature markets. But how is this so? How come nobody can step up and compete? After all, the community seems to think that Games Workshop is the best miniature company ever, the one that stands out above and beyond arguably better competition. Cool Mini or Not makes great games with pre-assembled miniatures in plastic. Flames of War, they do great historics, as do the crew behind Bolt Action. Mantic now dominates the square-based rank and file fantasy wargames market with Kings of War. Yet it's not Warhammer, it isn't the great and powerful Games Workshop. There isn't nobody scrambling to make a Warmer Hordes video game or movie. The economists go on to say, monopolies typically have an unfair advantage over their competition, since they either are the only provider of a product or control most of the market share or customers for their product. Although monopolies might differ from industry to industry, they tend to share similar characteristics that include these 4 key points, and I'll double back on them in a moment. Firstly, high barriers for entry. Competitors are not able to enter the market, and a monopoly can easily prevent competition from developing their foothold in an industry by acquiring the competition. Single seller. There is only one seller in the market, meaning the company becomes the same as the industry it serves. Price maker. The company that operates the monopoly decides the price of the product that it will sell without any competition keeping their prices in check. As a result, monopolies raise prices at will. Economies of scale. A monopoly can often produce at a lower cost than smaller companies. Monopolies can buy huge quantities of inventory, for example, usually at a volume discount. As a result, a monopoly can lower its prices so much that smaller competitors can't survive. Essentially, monopolies can engage in price wars due to their scale of manufacturing and distribution networks, such as their warehouses and shipping methods. That can be done at lower costs than any competitor in the industry. So, let's go back over those points. First of all, Games Workshop, they don't have to acquire other IPs to get rid of them. Why? Because they have their own better IP than almost any other. Sure, Star Wars, for example, they may be an exception here. But Games Workshop owns Lord of the Rings for all intents and purposes, and their fantasy and sci-fi settings are so big and so well fleshed out that anyone who is comparing a Games Workshop product to a competitor will likely swing towards Games Workshop due to the ease with which they may acquire a product, or due to fleshed out model ranges. What about being a single seller? Well, technically they farm out the product to third-party retailers. However, in line with point 3, they essentially predetermine everything. You must buy X amount of stock if you're one of their retailers. You can only sell it for a certain price, no cheaper. You cannot sell online, overseas, etc, etc, etc. They are the only one making Warhammer, and you better believe they raise prices at will, even in a pandemic. For economies of scale, well, you aren't going to outproduce Games Workshop anytime soon, let's put it that way. They have so much capital compared to the next guy, it's ridiculous. They come away at tax time with bonuses for the entire company, right down to the local store staff. That's how much bank they make. Who can compete with that? So, what are the types of monopolies, and can we tie Games Workshop to either of them? First, there's pure monopolies. A company with a pure monopoly means that a company is the only seller in a market with no close substitutes. For many years, Microsoft Corporation had a monopoly on the software and operating systems that are used in computers. Also, with pure monopolies, there are high barriers to entry, such as a significant startup cost preventing competitors from entering the market. There's also natural monopolies. A natural monopoly can develop when a company becomes a monopoly due to a high fixed or startup cost in the industry. Also, a natural monopoly can arise in industries that require unique raw materials, technology, or it's a specialized industry where only one company can meet the needs. Companies that have patents on their products, which prevent competition from developing the same product in a specific field, can have a natural monopoly. Patents allow the company to earn profit for several years without fear of competition to help recoup on investment, high startup, research and development costs that the company incurred. Of course, we also have monopolistic competition. When there are multiple sellers in an industry with many similar substitutes for the goods being produced and companies retain some power in the market, it's referred to as monopolistic competition. In this scenario, an industry has many businesses that offer similar products or services, but their offerings are not perfect substitutes. In some cases, this can lead to duopolies. In a monopolistic competitive industry, barriers to entry and exit are typically low, and companies try to differentiate themselves through price cuts and marketing efforts. However, since the products offered are so similar between the different competitors, it's difficult for consumers to tell which product is better. Some examples of monopolistic competition include retail stores, restaurants, and hair salons. For our particular case, it would be companies like Warlord Games, Mantic Games, Perry Miniatures. These sort of games are competing with Games Workshop. They're in the market. However, they do not offer things like the perfect substitutes, but we'll cover off on that more in a moment. So, does Games Workshop meet any of these monopolistic definitions? Well, for decades, they were definitely a pure monopoly, because nobody else made miniatures or miniature games like they did. Games Workshop got their start making models based on a very cheeky licensing agreement to sell Dungeons & Dragons in the UK, something that they actually tricked Gygax into, as he thought they were an actual company, not a few guys in the upstairs room of a house. Then what they did was they ripped off ideas from fantasy and sci-fi settings to create their own universe, which is what's kind of okay in my opinion, as the evolution of ideas is the backbone of creativity, although some of it was less homage or evolution rather than just direct blunt rip-off. But come the late 90s and early O's, there were competitors, so they cannot be a pure monopoly. And what about their monopolistic competition? The industry has many businesses that offer similar products or services. Kings of War versus Warhammer Fantasy. But their offerings are definitely not perfect substitutes. But customers can tell the difference between the two, as one is much more heavily marketed with brick and mortar stores, and the naming conventions of Games Workshop are unique and catchy to say the least. So, this leads me to the next point. Is Games Workshop a natural monopoly? Let's see. High startup costs. Bingo. Prepare to sink at least $1 million into your company if you want to create a line of plastics. It's not only a specialized industry, but the way dyes work and are made, well, there's probably only a few thousand of us in the world who know how to make an effective dye for complex shapes from scratch without having to use repetitive trial and error. A good example of this would be someone like Cool Mini or Not. Yes, they produce their miniatures in plastics, but they do it through Kickstarter campaigns for millions of dollars in order to actually fund it, because they don't have the capital to do it themselves. The only way they can get into the market is to be crowd-funded on each and every project. Then you have patents. Obviously, Games Workshop owns all Warhammer IP, and all their flavors also include things such as Tolkien's IP. I think we're onto a winner here. Games Workshop is a monopoly. Are they Standard Oil or Big Pharma? No, they're a small fish in the world of monopolies. What makes them special is that they don't offer an essential service, so no government would ever, or should, try and regulate them. But what does it mean for you as a customer? Well, these are the big flow-on effects that you don't realise. First, and most importantly, they set the price. And we're not talking the typical, hey, a business can set any price they like. Yeah, a business can do that. But when the business has competition, it means that there's a ceiling to that price. Before people go, you know what, your car costs too much, or your clothing costs too much, I'm going to go to the shop next door. Games Workshop doesn't have that problem. Their stuff is incredibly expensive, and it has to reach ludicrous levels before people will consider walking away, which is not something that will happen in other industries. They can raise and lower the price at will, and whatever they choose to do, you'll actually notice the rest of the miniatures industry follows, and that all prices actually are relative to Games Workshop's prices. In the Principles of Economics, Chapter 9.2, they say that, and I quote, "In the real world, a monopolist often does not have enough information to analyze its entire total revenues or total costs curves. After all, the firm does not know exactly what would happen if it were to alter production dramatically. But a monopolist often has fairly reliable information about how changing output by small or moderate amounts will affect its marginal revenues and marginal costs, because it has had experience with such changes over time, and because modest changes are easier to extrapolate from current experience. A monopolist can use information on marginal revenue and marginal cost to seek out the profit-maximizing combination of quantity and price. But the monopoly could seek out the profit-maximizing level of output by increasing quantity by a small amount, calculating marginal revenue and marginal cost, and then either increasing output as long as marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, or reducing output if marginal costs exceed marginal revenue." Okay, big word soup there, and horrible to say. But what does it mean to you and I, the layman? It means that once they pre-sell their Indominus boxes, they know how much it costs, they've already factored in all their overheads. They've made all their money back already with their pre-sales. The only cost they incur now to produce more is production and distribution, both of which is incredibly cheap in miniature wargaming. So you ever wonder why they opened a new round of sales for Indominus? Just to give little Jimmy a chance to have his own set? No, it was basically pure profit. Next, if they want to create a competitor to your product, they have the money and resources to do so thanks to their power. And if they want, they can probably crush your product. You make a skirmish game, they can make 5 and flesh them out in 1 year. Third, they own an IP which is locked down and can't be developed or built upon by others. If you try and make conversion parts for Games Workshop products, they have to be different enough that you don't get sued, thanks to patent law. However, even if you do achieve this legally, their efforts to monopose miniatures over the last 3 years has meant that many aftermarket parts cannot be easily fitted to their miniatures. This either forces you to turn to Games Workshop themselves for such parts, or simply forego the inclusion of such parts in your force. Now, there are some other interesting things to take into consideration when it comes to Games Workshop's competition. People often point out that a particular game system they've moved to from Games Workshop is a better game system. Bolt action is better than 40k is quite a common one. Okay, but you only know that because you know what 40k is. It's rare that someone who's new to the wargaming hobby will gravitate towards bolt action, and if somehow exposed to that and a Games Workshop game at the same time, pick that first. It's unlikely. In fact, I'd say a more determinate factor would be the setting of the game. If you're into World War II, you're probably going to turn there before you look at floating dwarves in Age of Sigmar. Let's pretend, however, that you're big into fantasy games and you get exposed to Warhammer Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, and Mantic's Kings of War simultaneously. Very unlikely, but bear with me. Warhammer Fantasy versus Kings of War is direct correlation. You likely don't know about Games Workshop's scummy business practices, so that's off the board. But you see 3 big things. First, the price. Games Workshop is going to stick out because it's more expensive, by a mile. But the second thing you notice is Games Workshop is mostly easy to build plastics and the models are just plain nicer in a lot of circumstances. Then, the third thing, the universe. Well, Warhammer Fantasy is a huge fleshed out IP which is brimming with detail thanks to 40 years of continuous development, with dozens of YouTube channels dedicated to the lore, video game tie-ins, novels, etc. The other game is developed by Mantic. Then you include Age of Sigmar into this cauldron. It's a skirmish system, so different to the tactical playstyle of Kings of War and Warhammer Fantasy, but it's a lower model count, offsetting its barrier to entry. Suddenly, it's more appealing now. the universe it lives in is just fucking terrible, a lazy rip-off of various realms of Norse mythology and cues stolen from the old world, it may not be Warhammer Fantasy, but it apes it well enough to the casual. And it's still more than what Mantic has created, no offense to them. For the record, Kings of War is a great game, and actively does almost everything right that I say Games Workshop does wrong. But when a new player comes into the hobby, they're most likely to start with a Games Workshop game. Not everyone, but let's face it, it's the minority, not the majority, who start with something like Infinity and then make the jump across to Games Workshop. It seems to me that the IP itself, more than any other reason, is the key to their success. That said, the models may be a bit nicer in some circumstances, although people forget about some of the third-party sculpts out there, such as Creature Caster. Seriously, compare their dragons to Games Workshop's, holy fuck. But you can join this fantastic universe, developed over 30 years of 40k and 40 years for fantasy, which they are so keen to dismantle in the name of short-term sales, with hyper-aggressive marketing, strict intellectual property control, very antagonistic behaviour towards competition, pushing the IP on multiple platforms such as tabletop, on TV, movies, video games. Who can realistically compete with that? Fantasy Flight Games has X-Wing, Armada and Legion, and that's basically the Star Wars universe in a nutshell. They are limited by the confines of that IP, and no other IP they come up with will have the same appeal as the established universes. Not without some kind of pop culture wave pushing it. A great example of this might be the new Dune movie. If it succeeds, and it pushes a competent game at the same time, with a low buy-in and fantastic sculpts, that could sell. But the thing is, it's not 40k and it's not even Age of Sigmar. Games Workshop doesn't just dominate the miniatures market. Short of self-implosion, they are the monopoly. This is from the Federal Trade Commission of the United States, and worth thinking about it. I quote, "Courts do not require a literal monopoly before applying rules for single firm conduct. That term is used as a shorthand for a firm with significant and durable market power. That is, the long-term ability to raise price or exclude competitors. That is how the term is used here. A monopolist is a firm with significant and durable market power. Courts look at the firm's market share, but typically do not find monopoly power if the firm, or a group of firms acting in concert, has less than 50% of the sales of a particular product or service within a certain geographic area. Some courts have required much higher percentages. In addition, the leading position must be sustainable over time. If competitive forces or the entry of new firms could discipline the conduct of the leading firm, courts are unlikely to find that the firm has lasting market power." I'll now ask you this. Do the other games in your area, you, the person listening to this video, make up more than 50% of all the war games you see going on? 50% of the sales. If I go to a big wargaming event, how many halls are devoted to Warhammer and how many to other games? Almost every big event I go to, 3/4 of it is Warhammer, and there's a lot more models on those Warhammer tables than the other tables. Yeah, I think it speaks for itself. Oh, but consider this next line an attack for those who think I'm being aggressive. Wait for this. I find it incredibly ironic that they're so defensive of their IP, considering that they stole their ideas from other places. I do think stories should build upon what came before, I said it earlier today, but to try and copyright things you take from others and history is a dick move. This company tried to copyright the term Space Marine. Not too bad, but words like pauldron and halberd. Just remember that a UK-based company tried to copyright the names of a weapon and an armor component that are over 700 years old, just to leverage a little more control. John Hicks, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1972, wrote, "The best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life." What he means by this is that the monopoly doesn't need to change or please the customer, as the customer is essentially stuck with them. Think that 8th and 9th edition fluff for 40k is terrible? Guess what? You're in the majority. But Games Workshop has no need to make it better because it sells. You can't get Games Workshop products and books from anywhere else. You have to buy it from them. So it doesn't matter if it's really lackluster. Interestingly, when the telecom giant AT&T was split up in the 1980s, the sub-companies fostered a wave of innovation amongst themselves because they had to compete with one another for the market share. They had to bring in things such as call waiting, caller ID, three-way calling, voicemail, etc. Imagine what would happen if the 40k license, hypothetically, was opened up to allow Xenos to be developed by one firm and Marines by another. I think you'd see a few more Xenos releases then. Not practical, of course, but you hopefully get what I mean here. During the drafting of this video, and yes, this needed many scripts, more and more was said to me which made me think. People come so close to the point and yet miss it by the narrowest of margins when it comes to talking about their monopolistic behaviour. They'll say weird things like how killing off Warhammer Fantasy is a good move. That one's cited by people all the time, as it shows the company can evolve new IPs and grow the game. Okay, sure, but consider this. They not only completely fumbled Age of Sigmar's release, with a single page of rules and massive backlash leading to a significant financial hit that year, but they didn't have a decent game on their hands until 2nd edition Age of Sigmar, and functionally, the gameplay between Sigmar and 40k is closer than Fantasy and 40k ever was, making me wonder why it's even two separate systems at times. They got rid of the neckbeards and old-timers, sure, but they constantly export characters from Warhammer Fantasy into Age of Sigmar with new and impressive outfits, and then they're re-releasing some form of Warhammer Fantasy in the future at Forge World. So they must care about something. Is it because they gave the rank and file system to Mantic on a platter and now they have to reclaim it? Seems to me like that, because it's not the first time. They did it with Blood Bowl. Blood Bowl is there to kill Dreadball. Titanicus goes head to head with Battletech and Aeronautica with X-Wing. Think they don't cross paths? Well, I can assure you that people invested in Games Workshop games in their universe are not going to walk away from Games Workshop to go play those games when their needs are being satisfied within Games Workshop. Games Workshop is a monopoly. They set the prices they want, when they want, and they pick who can sell their products. They work hard to make sure that third parties cannot sell parts that easily synchronize with their products. This doesn't make them good or bad. Despite saying this, and yet I guarantee idiots in the comments will jump up and accuse me of attacking them, again, for pointing out the obvious. What it does make them is smart. Smart enough at least to leverage their power over the market and flex their legal biceps whenever anyone comes near their IP. Anyway, that's enough from me. I've waffled on at length about all sorts of highly riveting financial stuff. I want to know what you think. Do you think they're a monopoly? Or do you think that somehow the fact that they haven't dipped their toe into historics means that they aren't? Me personally, I think they pretty much have the miniatures market cornered. And even the decent competition, it's nothing compared to the sheer size of them. Anyway, Mac with the Outer Circle, thank you all for watching this episode. Hope you enjoy it, and please, comment below. See you all next time.